The hallway light snapped on at 04:12 a.m., then died under the shock of steel. A battering ram kissed the door once, twice, and the entire frame exploded inward. Federal agents! The shout hit the walls like gunfire. Boots flooded the house in a disciplined wave. DEA jackets, rifles tight to shoulders, flashlights carving white tunnels through smoke. A woman stood at the end of the corridor as if she had been expecting them. Small, perfectly still, hair pulled back, eyes cold and awake. No panic, no scream, just a calm that didn't belong to the hour. Two agents moved in fast. One pinned her wrists, the other snapped cuffs shut with a metallic finality. The steel clicked like a verdict. Behind her, the house opened like a vault. A false wall slid away. Bricks of cocaine stacked in plastic wrap. Clean, uniform, endless. A closet became a cash room. Bundles of dollars bound tight, smelling of paper, sweat, and gasoline. On a kitchen table, ledgers in coded Spanish, phone numbers written like prayers, a Polaroid of men holding rifles beside speedboats. Evidence bags filled in seconds, photographs, scales, seals, keys to safe deposit boxes. An agent read the charges. Conspiracy to import, to manufacture, to distribute. Enough to bury a person under years. The number 15 hung in the air like a noose. She didn't blink. She looked at the rifles, the gloves, the trembling adrenaline in young hands, and smiled faintly, as if the raid was simply another chapter she had already survived. By sunrise, the war had a new address, an evidence room under fluorescent lights where truth was measured in weight, ink, and fingerprints. Metal tables stretched across the floor like operating beds. Agents laid the seizure out in rows, brick after brick, plastic wrapped, stamped with crude logos, each one a silent witness. Next came the money. Bundles stacked in towers, counted by machines that never got tired, the numbers climbing until they sounded unreal. In the center sat the heart of it all. 3 notebooks, leather-bound, edges worn smooth by use. Not diaries, ledgers. Columns of coded Spanish, initials that meant nothing until the analysts began cross-matching them with wiretap transcripts and airport manifests. Dates aligned. Cities repeated like a pulse. New York, Miami, Medellin. Under each location, quantities, payments, losses, taxes, paid to men with guns. A technician slid photographs across the table, safe houses, faces, license plates, surveillance stills of couriers carrying suitcases too heavy for the way they smiled. There were keys to lockboxes, a stack of passports under different names, and maps marked with routes that ignored borders the way hurricanes ignore streets. Then the detective in charge pinned a single printout on the board. Griselda Blanco, aliases beneath it, nicknames circled in red. Cocaine Godmother, Black Widow. The room went quiet, as if those titles carried a temperature drop. This wasn't a gang, it was a system. Imports, distribution crews, enforcers, money pipelines, built with discipline and fear. And standing at the center of every line, every coded number, every disappearing body, was a woman who ran her empire like a factory and protected it like a kingdom. The board in the evidence room didn't look like a crime scene anymore. It looked like a map of a country that wasn't supposed to exist. Red strings ran from city to city, New York to Miami, Miami to the Caribbean, lines crossing oceans toward Colombia like veins feeding a heart. Every line ended at a name, an alias, a blurred face pulled from surveillance, a number pulled from the ledgers, and every road, every single one bent back to the same center. The lead detective stood there with a black marker in his hand, staring at the photograph they'd pinned up. A woman with a calm expression that felt almost insulting. Not because she looked innocent, she didn't, but because she looked certain. Like someone who had spent her whole life believing consequences were for other people. He circled her name once, slow and deliberate. Griselda Blanco. On the table beside him lay the evidence of a structure, not chaos, courier lists, safe house keys, shipping codes, handwritten schedules like a business plan. The empire wasn't built on luck. It was built on design. Layers of insulation, disposable workers, payoffs, compartmentalized roles. A machine that could lose a limb and keep walking. A machine that didn't panic. It adapted. One young agent pointed at the ledger totals and whispered, half to himself, "How is this even possible?" The question wasn't about the weight of cocaine or the stacks of cash. It was about the mind behind it. The detective didn't answer. He stepped closer to the board and added 2 words under her name in thick ink. Control. Fear. Then he turned, voice low, the kind of voice that had lived too long around murder files. "We're not looking at a dealer," he said. "We're looking at a doctrine." He tapped the photo once, hard. How does a woman from nothing, no army, no badge, no country, build an empire inside the United States in the middle of a man's war and survive long enough to become a legend? The room stayed silent. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. Outside, Miami moved on like nothing had happened. But inside that evidence room, everyone could feel it. This wasn't the end of a case. It was the opening of a history they were about to bleed through. Cartagena didn't raise children. Cartagena sharpened them. In the 1940s, the city glittered for tourists at the edge of the sea, but behind that shine were alleys that smelled of salt, sweat, and rot. A place where hunger wasn't an emergency. It was a routine, where mothers learned to count coins the way priests counted prayers, and boys learned to run before they learned to read. Griselda was born into that grind in 1943, a name whispered over cracked floor tiles and cheap candlelight. There were no lullabies in her house, only arguments, debt, and the heavy silence after a man's footsteps disappeared down the street. People around her didn't talk about dreams. They talked about survival, about how a single wrong look could cost you teeth, about how the weak didn't get second chances. As a little girl, she watched women bargain for food like it was war. She saw police take bribes with the same boredom they took breath. She learned early that law wasn't justice. Law was a uniform, and uniforms could be bought. When fights broke out in the street, nobody ran to stop them. They stepped aside, waiting for the winner to stand. The lesson was simple and repeated. Power belongs to the one who doesn't flinch. At night, the city changed face. The sea breeze carried music from rich balconies, while the slums swallowed that sound and replaced it with whispers. Smugglers, thieves, men with knives who spoke softly because they knew they didn't need to shout. Griselda listened from doorways, eyes too sharp for her age. She memorized faces. She studied hunger. She watched fear move through people like an invisible hand around their throats. By the time she was old enough to understand what innocence was, Cartagena had already taken it from her. It wasn't stolen in one moment. It was carved away day by day by the kind of poverty that teaches a child something worse than anger. It teaches them that life has no mercy, and mercy is for fools. And somewhere in that city of shadows, a young girl began to believe a dangerous truth. If the world was built to crush her, then she would become the kind of person it couldn't crush at all. It happened on a day that looked ordinary from far away. Bright Caribbean sun, gulls circling above roofs, the city pretending to be calm. But Cartagena's streets were never truly quiet. Violence lived under the surface like heat trapped in stone, waiting for the smallest spark. Griselda was still young, thin as a reed, her feet bare, her eyes already trained to scan for danger the way other children searched for games. The market was crowded, loud with bargaining and insults. A man slapped a woman for asking for credit. Nobody stopped him. A boy snatched fruit and ran. Nobody chased him. That was the order of things. Predators and prey separated only by courage and cruelty. Griselda moved through bodies like smoke, slipping between shoulders, touching pockets with a careful hand, watching who noticed and who didn't. She saw the necklace first, cheap gold, hanging from the throat of a well-fed woman who didn't belong to the slum side of the city. The chain glittered like an insult. Griselda's stomach tightened, not with greed, but with something sharper. That necklace meant food. It meant days without begging. It meant power in a world where children were treated like stray dogs. Her hand reached out, and the clasp snapped open with a practiced flick she didn't remember learning. The necklace vanished into her palm. One breath, one step, and she was already turning away, until a grip like iron clamped down on her wrist. A boy older than her, maybe 12 or 13, pulled her back hard enough to make her bones ache. "Thief!" he hissed, loud enough for others to hear. His eyes were bright with the kind of cruelty boys used to impress men. He didn't want the necklace. He wanted to make her bleed. People turned. Faces sharpened. A small circle formed like a ring in a street fight. The woman screamed. The boy twisted Griselda's wrist until tears burned behind her eyes. Shame rose in her throat, thick and bitter. She understood instantly what would happen next. She would be beaten, dragged, branded, made into an example. Then she saw it, half hidden behind a basket of fish. A small knife, its handle dark with grime. Her fingers closed around it before her mind had time to argue. She swung once, low and fast, more instinct than thought. The blade cut flesh. The boy jerked back, gasping, his confidence collapsing into shock. For a second, everything froze. The market noise fell away. Griselda stared at the spreading red on his shirt as if she had opened a door she couldn't close again. The boy's knees hit the ground. People stepped back, eyes wide, not from horror, but from recognition. They had seen this before, not the act itself, but the type of person it created. Griselda didn't scream. She didn't drop the knife. She just stood there, breathing hard, her heart pounding like a drum in her ribs. She felt something inside her shift, something cold, settling into place. She realized the terrible truth that Cartagena never taught gently. Hesitation is what kills you. Fear is what makes you a victim. When she finally ran, she didn't run like a guilty child. She ran like someone who had learned the rules of her world in blood, someone who understood that in the streets, the first strike isn't cruelty. It's permission to live. That night, Cartagena felt smaller than ever. The alleys that once hid her now seemed to whisper her name. Every stray dog bark sounded like a warning. Every footstep behind her made the back of her neck burn. The market incident hadn't ended with blood on the stones. It had started a countdown. In a city like this, a boy collapsing in public wasn't just an injury. It was an insult, and insults demanded payment. Griselda didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, listening to her mother breathe, listening to distant voices in the street, imagining the woman with the necklace, the boy's furious family, the men who would come looking with belts, knives, maybe worse. She could already picture it. Hands dragging her out, neighbors watching without helping, the punishment delivered as entertainment. Cartagena loved a lesson. At dawn, she made her choice with the calm of someone twice her age. No crying, no goodbye speech. She gathered what she could carry, a small cloth bag, a piece of bread, a few coins stolen over months and hidden like treasure. She didn't wake anyone. She didn't kiss her mother's forehead. Affection was dangerous. It weakened you. And weakness, she had learned, was the most expensive habit in the world. She walked fast, staying close to walls, cutting through back paths that smelled of sewage and rainwater. She avoided open streets. She avoided men. Her eyes worked like a weapon, measuring threats, looking for exits. Twice she saw strangers glance too long, and she changed direction without hesitation. By midday, she reached the edge of the city where the houses thinned and the road began to swallow everything. She rode in the back of a truck with sacks of produce hidden under canvas, the heat pressing against her skin. The driver didn't ask questions. In Colombia, silence was a service. Every bump in the road shook her bones, but she stayed still, biting her lip until it tasted like metal. She wasn't running away anymore. She was moving forward into something unknown, something she could shape. As Cartagena faded behind dust and distance, she felt no sadness, only relief. The city had given her two things: the knowledge that innocence was a lie, and the certainty that her life belonged to whoever had the will to seize it. In the next town, she learned how easy it was to become someone else. Change your name, change your story, change your face. People believed what was useful to them. She worked small hustles, carrying bags, cleaning floors, selling lies with a straight expression. Each job taught her something. Each day hardened her. By the time she looked back at her reflection in a cracked mirror, she barely recognized the child from Cartagena. The eyes were the same, but colder now, more focused, like a blade sharpened on stone. That was her first escape, not just from a city, but from the version of herself that still thought survival required permission. New York didn't greet people, it swallowed them. In the early 1970s, the city was a living bruise. Graffiti bleeding across subway walls, sirens stitched into the night, steam rising from manholes like the streets were breathing anger. It was cold in a way Cartagena had never been. Not just the weather. The cold in New York lived in faces that refused eye contact, in hands shoved deep into pockets, in the silent agreement that nobody would save you. Griselda arrived with nothing that could be proven on paper. A woman with an accent, a hard stare, and an ability to stand in chaos without trembling. She didn't come chasing dreams. She came chasing leverage. In neighborhoods where the lights flickered and rent was overdue, she recognized the same hunger she'd grown up with, only dressed in heavier coats. The streets were crowded with small-time hustlers, men selling stolen watches, teenagers moving pills, women trading bodies for heat and food. Every corner had a price tag. Every favor had a hidden interest rate. And in the middle of it all, cocaine was starting to appear like a new religion. White powder passed in nightclub bathrooms, in limousines, in back rooms where rich men pretended they weren't afraid of the city. New York was learning to crave it, and cravings made markets. She watched how it moved, who brought it, who protected it, who got killed for it. That was the difference between foolish crime and profitable crime. Profit needed structure, and structure needed brains more than muscle. At first, she stayed small, invisible. She learned the rhythm of the blocks, when police patrols passed, which cops took money, which landlords asked questions. She learned that the city's real borders weren't lines on maps. They were controlled by crews, by fear, by who owned the hallway of an apartment building. She memorized these invisible boundaries the way other immigrants memorized bus routes. Then she started making herself useful. Not as a seller on the street sellers were disposable, but as someone who could connect people. A quiet introduction here, a friend of a friend there. She built relationships the way spiders build webs, patiently, without emotion, always with an exit planned. She listened more than she spoke. She studied men's egos like weaknesses in armor. She let them believe they were in control while she measured the room. Cocaine became the perfect product for her mind. It wasn't like stolen goods or petty scams. It was clean, fast, high value. It traveled easy and sold itself. It turned ordinary people into repeat customers. And repeat customers were predictable. Predictability was power. Soon, what looked like random street dealing started to shift. A few corner boys stopped working for loud gangs and began taking orders from quieter voices. A delivery system formed. Small packages moving through apartments, through taxis, through women carrying handbags that looked harmless. The city didn't notice the change because the city was used to crime, but crime itself was evolving into business. Griselda stood at the edge of that transformation, watching the market form like ice spreading across water. She didn't need the streets to love her. She only needed them to obey. And New York, this brutal, indifferent monster of a city, was about to become her first factory. In New York, doors didn't open because you knocked. They opened because someone owed you or feared you. Griselda understood that quickly, and she understood something else even faster. In the cocaine world, power didn't belong to the loudest man. It belonged to whoever controlled supply. The street could hustle all day, but without the source, the street was just hunger-wearing sneakers. That was how she noticed Alberto Bravo. He wasn't flashy like the nightclub men who threw money to impress strangers. He moved with a calm confidence, the kind that comes from knowing he carried something everyone wanted. Alberto was Colombian too, part of that invisible network of immigrants and smugglers who spoke in half sentences and never looked surprised. He had contacts, real ones, people who didn't sell grams, they moved kilos, people with boats, pilots, and friends in uniforms. Their first meeting wasn't romantic, it was transactional. They sat in a cramped apartment where the curtains stayed closed even in daylight. The air smelled of cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. Alberto spoke about shipments, routes, prices. Griselda listened like she was reading a contract. She asked questions that made him pause, sharp questions. Questions about loss percentage, about couriers, about what happened when someone got arrested. The men around Alberto laughed at first because she was a woman. Then they stopped laughing when she kept speaking with the calm of someone who had already survived worse than prison. Alberto saw it too. Not softness, not charm, strategy. He offered her access to his circle, and she offered him something rarer than loyalty: discipline. She didn't get high on the product. She didn't brag. She didn't waste. She treated cocaine like inventory, not temptation. And she understood that money without control was just fuel for disasters. They became partners the way criminals do, fast, intense, sealed by risk. Marriage came later, almost like paperwork, because in their world, a spouse wasn't love. A spouse was trust with a signature. With Alberto, her reach expanded overnight. She wasn't negotiating with street sellers anymore. She was in rooms where men argued over shipments the way generals argued over territory. But she didn't become smaller in his shadow. She became sharper. She learned the supply chain from the inside. Who bribes dock workers? Who owns the warehouse? Who knows the flight schedules? She learned how one phone call in Colombia could flood New York with product in a week. She watched Alberto's men handle cash like fools, spending it loudly, drawing heat, acting like kings. Griselda hated that kind of stupidity. Stupidity attracted attention. Attention attracted agents. Agents ended empires. So she began building her own method. She organized couriers like soldiers. She demanded silence. She punished careless talk. She tracked every dollar and every gram. While Alberto treated the business like a rush, she treated it like architecture, planning foundations, building walls, designing escapes. Men started to notice deals ran smoother when she was present. Losses dropped. Payments arrived on time. The street crews followed orders without tantrums. It wasn't because she was kind. It was because her voice carried something colder than threats: certainty. Alberto had opened the door, but Griselda was already walking through it like she owned the building. Griselda didn't see cocaine as a product. She saw it as a process. The men around her loved the thrill, the fast cash, the nightclub glow, the swagger of danger. She despised that weakness. A thrill fades, a system survives, and New York, with its endless appetite and endless hiding places, was the perfect city to test a machine. She started by breaking the business into parts the way a factory breaks down a weapon: sourcing, packaging, transport, storage, distribution, laundering. Each part had its own crew. Each crew knew only what it needed to know. If one piece failed, the rest kept moving. That was her first innovation: compartmentalization. In the street world, everyone bragged about knowing everything. Griselda built an empire where ignorance was protection. Then came the packaging. She didn't trust sloppy wraps and improvised hiding spots. She demanded uniformity, blocks sealed tight, marked, measured, numbered. She treated every kilo like inventory that had to arrive intact, because missing product meant panic, and panic meant mistakes. Mistakes meant heat. Transport was where she became truly different. While other crews relied on brute force, guns, intimidation, street muscle, Griselda weaponized invisibility. She studied who moved freely through airports and ports without suspicion. Not hardened men with criminal faces, women, quiet travelers, couriers with clean records, soft voices, ordinary clothes. In her mind, the best disguise was normality. She built courier lines like assembly belts: recruit, test, train, deploy, replace. A courier would never know the supplier's name, never see the warehouse, never meet the top men. They carried sealed packages and followed scripted instructions like actors reciting lines. If police stopped them, they had rehearsed stories, rehearsed tears, rehearsed panic. Some didn't even know what they carried, only that the payout was enough to change their lives. And the method of concealment became a dark kind of art. She invested in custom tailoring, modified garments, hidden pockets stitched into fabric with precision, luggage with false bottoms, toys with hollow cores, boxes of ordinary goods wrapped in layers that fooled quick searches. It wasn't romantic crime. It was production engineering. Cocaine didn't travel like contraband anymore. It traveled like cargo. The same discipline applied to money. She didn't let cash pile up in one place, tempting thieves and attracting raids. She created a stream. Cash collected in small drops, moved through fronts, washed through businesses that looked boring on paper. Beauty salons, clothing shops, small import companies, the kind of places nobody respected enough to suspect. Money entered dirty and left clean, reappearing in real estate, jewelry, and offshore accounts like magic. To her crews, the rules were brutal and simple: silence, speed, precision. Talkers vanished, drunks were cut loose. Anyone who got sloppy became a warning. She didn't need to scream for obedience. Fear did it for her. Fear managed like policy. By the time law enforcement began noticing patterns, it was already too late. They weren't facing random street dealers anymore. They were facing a manufacturing empire. Cold, efficient, repeatable. A business that could run without its founder for weeks and still flood New York with white powder like snowfall. Griselda had turned smuggling into industry, and in that industry, she wasn't just a participant. She was the engineer. April 1975 didn't arrive with sirens. It arrived with paper. Thin sheets stamped with federal seals, typed in cold legal language, signed by men who believed ink could stop blood. An indictment moved through offices in Manhattan like a silent weapon, passed hand to hand, filed, copied, sealed. To the government, it was procedure. To the cocaine world, it was a declaration of war. A clerk at the courthouse didn't know he was touching history when he stamped the date. The case name meant nothing to him. But inside those pages were dozens of names connected by phone calls, cash drops, and coded shipments. Conspiracy was the word that held it all together. Conspiracy to traffic cocaine, to import, to distribute, It was broad enough to catch anyone who had breathed near the network. And in the margins of that expanding net, one name began to glow hotter than the others: Griselda Blanco. In a DEA office, agents pinned photographs to boards, drew lines, circled faces. New York detectives who had spent years chasing heroin crews stared at cocaine maps and realized they were late to the disease. The city was changing. The powder was richer than heroin, cleaner to move, and the violence behind it was colder. A veteran agent, hands scarred from decades of raids, ran his finger across the case file and muttered, "This isn't street crime. This is organized invasion." When the indictment was unsealed, the first shock wave wasn't arrests. It was panic. Phones went dead. Safe houses emptied overnight. Couriers vanished. Men who once bragged in nightclubs started watching doorways like hunted animals. Some tried to buy their way out with cash. Others tried to run. But the smartest didn't run blindly. They disappeared with intention. Griselda read the news through whispers, not newspapers. A messenger came to her with a warning that felt like a gun pressed against the spine. Federal names, federal charges, federal time. In her world, prison wasn't the worst outcome. Prison was a door to something worse. Betrayals, informants, bodies traded for reduced sentences. A case like this didn't just threaten freedom. It threatened the entire architecture she had built. She reacted in a way that defined her. Not hysterical, not frantic, clinical. She called meetings in small apartments where curtains stayed closed. She made the same demand she always made: silence. Then she began cutting loose every weak link. People who knew too much were moved out of the city. Some were paid, some were threatened. A few simply never answered their phones again. Law enforcement expected their paper to force her into a corner. But paper only works on people who respect it. Griselda didn't respect indictments. She respected momentum. She understood the truth before the agents did. This case wasn't going to end with a clean arrest. This case was going to ignite a chain reaction. Betrayal, disappearances, retaliations, new alliances forged out of fear. The government had thrown the first punch with a document. And somewhere in New York's shadow, Griselda Blanco began preparing her answer. An answer not written in ink, but in the language she trusted most: speed, violence, and disappearance. The day the indictment surfaced, New York changed shape. Not on the surface. Subways still rattled, taxis still honked, drunk men still spilled out of clubs. But underneath, the cocaine network tightened like a fist. Everyone suddenly felt the invisible presence of federal eyes. Doors that used to open with a password now stayed locked. Phone calls became shorter. Meetings moved from apartments to moving cars. And in that pressure, Griselda made the one decision that separated predators from fools. She would not wait to be hunted. She vanished with the efficiency of a woman who had practiced disappearing her whole life. There were no dramatic goodbyes, no last night celebration. One moment she was here, issuing orders in a dim room, cigarette smoke hanging over maps. The next, her chair was empty. Her men found only instructions: cold, written, precise. Cash moved before she did. Documents burned. Safe houses were wiped clean like they had never existed. A courier who showed up late found a locked door and a street that suddenly felt too open. The authorities didn't understand it at first. Agents went to the addresses in their files and kicked in doors expecting bodies and bundles. They found dust, abandoned mattresses, a few crumbs of evidence, a cheap perfume bottle, a single phone number scratched inside a drawer. It was like chasing a ghost that knew the building plans. Griselda traveled like contraband. She wore nothing that screamed wealth, no jewelry, no flashy coat. Her hair plain, her face expressionless. She moved through the airport with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what security looked for and exactly what it ignored. She didn't look like a kingpin. She looked like another immigrant woman returning home. And the moment her plane lifted off, she felt the shift. The tightness in her chest loosened, replaced by something colder than relief. Calculation. New York was becoming a trap. Colombia was not a refuge, it was the workshop. It was where she could reset, rebuild, strengthen, where the laws weren't written for justice, but for whoever carried the bigger gun. Back in Medellin, the air itself felt different, thicker, heavier, loaded with unspoken deals. Men watched her closely. Some expected her to be broken after fleeing the U.S. Instead, she arrived with a dangerous kind of calm. The calm of someone who had seen the enemy's playbook and refused to be caught inside it. She met with suppliers, cartels, middlemen who dressed like businessmen and spoke like predators. She offered them not just connections, but strategy. How the Americans hunted, how they listened, how they built cases, how they followed money. And she promised something the men in Colombia respected more than loyalty: expansion. Miami was rising. The port city was turning into a cocaine paradise. If New York was a factory, Miami could be a kingdom. But before any of that could happen, she had to do what all great criminals do after escaping law enforcement: purge weakness. In Colombia, rumors traveled faster than bullets. She could feel distrust swirling around her name. People wondered if she had run because she had talked. They didn't know her well enough yet. So she staged her return like a message. She didn't hide in silence. She positioned herself. She built alliances. She paid off guards, fed informants, bought safe routes. She let people see her alive, strong, untouched. She ensured the streets repeated a new story. The Americans tried to take her, and failed. To the DEA, her flight looked like retreat. To Griselda, it was something else entirely. It was reloading. When Griselda returned, it wasn't as a fugitive crawling back into the dark. It was as a force reorganized. In Colombia, she had studied the war from a distance, watched American agents move like slow machines, watched indictments bloom into arrests, watched informants trade names for time. She learned the weakness of her enemies. They needed proof. They needed paperwork. They needed bodies willing to testify. So she sharpened her empire against those needs. Her comeback began with Miami. In the late 1970s, the city was transforming into a neon frontier. Wealth flashing under palm trees, nightclubs pulsing like hearts, speedboats slicing through black water. Miami looked clean to tourists, but beneath the glamour, it was becoming an open wound. Cocaine flowed in through the coast like a tide, and everyone wanted their cut. Cuban crews, Colombian traffickers, corrupt cops, hungry street gangs. The city was ripe with chaos, and chaos was a ladder for someone who understood control. Griselda stepped into that chaos like it belonged to her. She didn't rebuild the old way. She didn't bring New York's crews south. She built Miami with new faces, new rules, new silence. She rented houses under false names, scattered stash locations like landmines, and ran shipments through channels that didn't even touch the streets until the last moment. Her couriers changed weekly. Her cars changed daily. Her meetings happened in motion, never in one place long enough for surveillance to settle. Most importantly, she returned with teeth. In New York, she had used fear like a tool. In Miami, she weaponized it. Rivals tested her at first, believing her to be just another trafficker relocating. They tried to steal product. They threatened her couriers. One crew attempted to intercept a drop near the causeway. It was small, almost petty, until her response made the entire city listen. A man from that crew was found the next morning in a parking lot, face down, hands still raised as if begging. No message left on paper, no warning letter. The message was the body itself. Miami understood that language instantly. From then on, whispers replaced insults. People stopped saying her name loudly. Law enforcement began seeing the pattern the way doctors see symptoms. Violent spikes around certain routes, a certain kind of execution, a certain discipline behind the madness. But whenever detectives stepped closer, the trail went cold. Witnesses disappeared. Informants suddenly lost their nerve. Safe houses were empty by the time warrants arrived. It was like chasing a shadow that moved before the light could touch it. Griselda wasn't just selling cocaine, she was constructing dominance. She bought loyalty with money and sealed it with terror. She demanded precision from her men the way commanders demanded it in war. Sloppy handling wasn't forgiven. Loose talk wasn't punished. It was erased. And because she was a woman in a world of male violence, she became something even more dangerous, unpredictable in the minds of men who underestimated her. Miami didn't know it yet, but the cocaine war had just changed commanders. A new kind of boss had entered the city, one who didn't need a crew of loud soldiers to be feared. Her power came from structure, secrecy, and the terrifying certainty that she would always strike back harder than anyone expected. She hadn't returned to survive. She had returned to rule. Miami, in the early 1980s, was a fever dream with a gun pressed to its temple. Neon signs flickered over Ocean Drive like the city was trying to hypnotize itself into forgetting what it had become. Tourists drank cocktails under palm trees while, a few streets away, men loaded rifles into trunks and counted cash with hands that still smelled of cordite. The air carried two perfumes at once, salt from the ocean and the sharp chemical bite of cocaine. At night, the city glowed. Clubs pulsed with bass mirrors, sweat. Models danced beside bankers. Politicians laughed beside men who never gave their real names. In restroom stalls, powder changed hands like communion. White lines drawn on glass, rolled bills passing mouth to nose. The promise of invincibility swallowed in seconds. Cocaine didn't just get people high, it made them reckless. And reckless people paid well. That appetite turned Miami into a port of obsession. Speedboats skimmed across black water, running without lights, guided only by stars and greed. Small planes cut through humid skies, landing on hidden strips where bundles were dragged off like bodies. Warehouses near the docks became temples, cold, guarded, silent, and around every shipment, violence waited like a shadow. The killings weren't whispers anymore. They were headlines. Drive-by shootings in broad daylight, bodies in canals, executions in parking lots where blood pooled under streetlights and mixed with rainwater. Rival crews fought over routes the way armies fought over bridges. The city learned a new soundtrack: sirens, screams, and the hollow clap of automatic fire echoing between concrete walls. People stopped lingering at red lights at night. Mothers kept children away from windows when cars slowed outside. Miami was becoming a battlefield dressed in tropical colors. Law enforcement tried to keep up, but Miami's crime wasn't built like the old street wars. This was industrial. It had logistics, finance, weapon suppliers, and men who understood they could buy time with bribes. A detective from homicide called it a second government. A DEA agent called it a flood we can't dam. Even judges whispered about the fear, because fear had reached the courtroom too. In that chaos, Griselda Blanco didn't struggle. She thrived. She watched Miami like a predator watches prey panic in tall grass. Most traffickers wanted visibility: flash cars, gold chains, attention. Griselda avoided attention like poison. She moved quietly, issuing orders through layers, building her network like a spiderweb over the city. She didn't need to own clubs to control them. She didn't need to stand on corners to own the streets. She only needed control of the supply and the will to protect it without hesitation. Her shipments hit Miami like clockwork. Her couriers didn't talk. Her stash houses changed often, rotating like pieces on a chessboard. If a rival tried to steal, retaliation came fast and final. Soon crews began to understand. There were drug lords in Miami, and then there was the Godmother. The city's neon lights still shone, the beaches still smiled. But beneath that shine, Miami was bleeding. Bleeding money, bleeding men, bleeding its own innocence. And cocaine was the blade. The first time detectives heard her name connected to a killing, they didn't believe it. Not because women didn't kill, Miami had seen everything by then, but because the violence carried a strange discipline. It wasn't random street rage, it was choreography. The kind of killing that left a message without leaving a note. It started at traffic lights. Witnesses described the same pattern over and over. A car stopping at a red light, windows half down in the humid heat. A motorcycle sliding up beside it, two riders, helmets on, faces erased. For a second, it looked normal, like any other impatient driver cutting through lanes. Then the passenger lifted a pistol and fired through glass at point-blank range. Quick shots, controlled, no screaming chase, no dramatic standoff, just execution. And then the motorcycle vanished into Miami's neon veins before anyone could breathe. Homicide scenes began to repeat like nightmares, bullet casings glittering on asphalt, blood running into storm drains, victims with hands still frozen on steering wheels as if trying to hold on to life by force. The killings weren't sloppy. They weren't emotional. They were efficient. An accountant's violence. That was what unsettled the detectives. Miami had seen rage killings. This was different. This was policy. Rumors spread through the underworld first, then through nightclubs, then into police notes scribbled at 3 a.m. in tired handwriting. La Madrina, the Godmother. People said she ordered hits the way others ordered food. People said she didn't raise her voice because she didn't need to. Fear raised it for her. Rivals learned quickly that negotiating with her was dangerous, not because she couldn't be bargained with, but because she treated betrayal like a disease. If someone skimmed product, if a courier talked too much, if a rival crew tested her borders, she responded like a surgeon cutting out infection, without mercy, without hesitation, and with enough brutality to stop others from even thinking of trying. One informant told the DEA a story that sounded like a legend, but Miami legends had a habit of being true. A mid-level dealer tried to cheat on a shipment and hide in a cheap motel near the port. He thought the police were his only threat. He was wrong. Two men entered his room with no masks, no panic, just calm. The motel clerk later said the dealer didn't scream. He only whispered one word before the shots. Madre. When detectives arrived, they found no struggle, no overturned furniture, no desperate fingerprints. Just a dead man on stained carpet and a single cigarette burning in an ashtray, still smoking like someone had waited long enough to watch him die. The message wasn't just death, it was control. Miami's criminals began changing behavior. They stopped holding meetings in the same place twice. They rotated guards. They carried weapons everywhere. But the more they armed themselves, the more paranoid they became. And paranoia made them easier to break. Griselda's violence didn't only remove enemies. It reshaped the psychology of the city. It taught everyone the same lesson. No one was untouchable. Even law enforcement felt the shift. Detectives started glancing at their rearview mirrors more often. Federal agents locked their cars even in daylight because Griselda's reputation wasn't built solely on murders. It was built on the terrifying idea that she wasn't afraid to bring war to anyone, criminal or cop, who stood between her and control. In Miami, the most dangerous thing wasn't the gun. It was the certainty behind the trigger. By 1981, Miami wasn't just a city with a drug problem. It was a city bleeding out in public. Homicides rose like a bad fever. Street cops were overwhelmed, homicide detectives were buried, and the morgue began treating bodies like inventory. The violence didn't look like one gang anymore. It looked like an economy. Cocaine had become the engine, and fear was the fuel. That was when the government stopped pretending this was normal crime. The task force came together in rooms that smelled of burnt coffee and sweat. Federal agents, local detectives, customs officers, men who didn't trust each other forced into the same war. SENTAC, DEA, joint squads stitched together like armor. A new board went up in the operations room, bigger than the last. Aerial photos of ports, lists of flight numbers, maps of canals and causeways. The city was divided into zones like a battlefield, and every zone had a name pinned to it. One name kept resurfacing, quietly at first, then with the weight of gravity. Griselda Blanco. The DEA had heard the nickname. Godmother. But nicknames didn't hold up in court. They needed proof. Intercepts, controlled buys, surveillance patterns. They needed something that could survive a judge. And the more they studied her network, the more frustrated they became. She wasn't flashy. She didn't show up at handoffs. She didn't touch product. She ran the system like a ghost runs a haunting, always present, never caught on camera in the act. So they changed strategy. If they couldn't catch her hands, they would catch her shadow. Surveillance poles went up in neighborhoods near suspected stash houses. Hidden cameras pointed at driveways. Unmarked cars rotated shifts, watching quietly from across streets, recording license plates, photographing faces. A new unit began building pattern files. Who visited, what time, how long they stayed, what cars appeared before shipments, what cars disappeared after. One detective called it watching the tide. Another called it waiting for the shark to surface. Wiretap teams followed next. They didn't listen to one phone. They listened to a web. Payphones outside clubs. Numbers scribbled inside ledgers found in unrelated arrests. Calls that lasted 7 seconds. Coded phrases that sounded like harmless family talk. The shirts arrived. Tell Auntie the party is tomorrow. Bring the sugar. Analysts sat for hours translating slang, mapping voices, pairing accents with movement on the street. The work was slow, maddening, but every intercept was a thread. Then came the human weapon, informants. Some were small-time couriers caught with ounces. Some were dealers facing decades. Some were bitter ex-lovers who wanted revenge more than freedom. The task force learned to handle them carefully because in a city like Miami, snitching didn't just get you killed. It got everyone you loved erased. Informants met agents in empty parking lots, in back rooms of diners, under bridges where engine noise could cover whispers. They spoke in trembling fragments, but the fragments formed a picture, a system run by fear, and a woman at the center who never forgave. The DEA began setting traps, controlled deliveries, bait shipments marked and tracked, cash bundles photographed and dusted. Undercover officers slipped into nightclubs where cocaine flowed like champagne. They watched for couriers, for messengers, for the moment the network revealed itself. And slowly, painfully, a truth emerged in the files. Griselda wasn't just part of Miami's cocaine war. She was one of its architects. The task force knew what that meant. This wouldn't end with a quick bust. It would require months, maybe years, surveillance, wiretaps, infiltration, and the kind of patience that costs sleep and marriages. But once the machine finally broke, it would break loudly, because in Miami, every empire collapsed the same way. Not with a whisper, with sirens. The first wiretap didn't sound like a kingpin. It sounded like nothing. Static, breathing, the soft click of coins dropping into a payphone. In the DEA's listening room, fluorescent lights buzzed above tired faces, headphones pressed against ears for hours at a time. Coffee burned in paper cups. The work was slow and humiliating, waiting for criminals to make mistakes, waiting for voices to reveal what guns never would. Miami's cocaine network didn't speak in full sentences. It spoke in code, in fragments, in jokes that weren't funny. A call would last 12 seconds. Tell the tailor the dresses are ready. Another voice would answer, not tonight, too much rain. Then silence. The analysts replayed it, wrote it down, circled words, compared them with other calls. Dress, tailor, rain. Nothing meant what it sounded like, but patterns began to form. They ran the taps like a web, not a line. One number connected to another, one voice to another, each call a bead in a chain. Pay phones outside nightclubs, phones inside small import shops, a number in a cheap apartment where nobody ever stayed long. When the task force hit a low-level courier and found a torn piece of paper in his shoe, they added that number too, and the web grew. Then they heard her nickname for the first time. A man's voice, nervous, fast, whispered into the receiver, "La Madrina, she wants it moved tonight." The room went still. The lead agent held up a hand and pointed to the recorder like it was a weapon. "Play it again." They listened to the way the word was spoken, not like respect, like dread. Madrina wasn't a label, it was a warning. But she didn't appear on the line. That was the cruelty of it. Everyone spoke about her, around her, under her, but never directly with her voice. She wasn't careless enough to sit on a phone and discuss business like an amateur. She used layers, middlemen, cutouts. If the police were listening, all they would hear was the skeleton of the operation, never the brain. So the DEA hunted the brain through the skeleton. They tagged voices like hunters tag animals. Voice A, Dominican accent, aggressive, short fuse. Voice B, Cuban, older, steady, sounded like a manager. Voice C, young woman, calm, likely a courier coordinator. Each voice got a file. Each file got photographs. Every time that voice appeared near a suspected stash house, surveillance teams wrote down license plates and followed. Sometimes it led nowhere. Sometimes it led to a dead end that smelled like a setup. But occasionally it led to gold. A warehouse rented under a fake name. A van that traveled the same route every Tuesday. A motel where couriers switched suitcases without ever looking inside. Night after night, the listening room became a confessional for criminals who didn't know they were confessing. The agents heard laughter after shipments landed, heard arguments when money went missing, heard a man begging for more time, heard another man promise, "I swear on my mother I didn't take it." Then a pause and a quiet reply, "Madrina doesn't care." The wiretaps did more than gather evidence. They revealed a truth the streets had already learned. The entire network operated under the pressure of one invisible presence. Even the men with guns sounded like children when her name entered a conversation. And in the darkness of those intercepted calls, the task force began to understand their enemy. They weren't chasing a gangster. They were chasing a mind that had turned fear into a language, spoken softly through phones across the city, controlling lives without ever raising its voice. Wiretaps gave the task force voices, but voices weren't enough. Voices didn't carry cocaine. Voices didn't hand over cash. Voices didn't place Griselda's hands on the machinery. To break an empire like hers, they needed something riskier than surveillance, something that could bleed. They needed a man inside. His name in the file was only a code, UC-17. In the streets, he became Rafa, a quiet broker from New Jersey with a cousin in customs and a talent for finding buyers who never asked questions. He wore the right clothes, cheap but clean. He spoke Spanish like someone who had learned it in pain. He didn't drink too much. He didn't laugh too loud. The best undercover identities weren't built with theater. They were built with restraint. The entry point wasn't Griselda herself. It never was. It was a courier hub disguised as ordinary life. An apartment above a laundromat where women came and went carrying bags of folded clothes. The building smelled of detergent and heat, the kind of place nobody would raid because it looked too boring to matter. But the task force knew boredom was often the mask of crime. Rafa's introduction was staged like a chess move. A low-level dealer the DEA had flipped, half terrified, half greedy, brought him in, vouching for him with shaking confidence. Inside, Rafa met a woman with sharp eyes and a voice too calm for the work she did. She wasn't a boss. She was worse, a gatekeeper. She asked questions like bullets. Who sent you? What's your route? How do you handle heat? How many kilos can you move without blinking? Rafa answered with practiced truth, half lies, half real details fed to him by the DEA. In this world, lies had to be laced with something real, or they smelled fake. The gatekeeper watched his hands, his pupils, his breathing. She wasn't looking for innocence. She was looking for weakness. He passed, but passing wasn't acceptance. It was probation. For weeks, he ran small tasks, a phone drop, a cash pickup, a package transfer that felt too light to be cocaine, testing him, watching him. Every task was surrounded by invisible guns. Rafa could feel it, men in parked cars, a stranger following too closely, a sudden wrong turn that forced him down unfamiliar streets to see if he panicked. He never did. Panic was death. The first real shipment came on a humid night when thunder rolled over Miami like distant artillery. Rafa was told to meet at a gas station near the highway. No names, no delays. A van pulled in, engine idling, windows dark. Two men stepped out with the blank faces of paid soldiers. One opened the rear door and revealed the cargo. Sealed bags buried under laundry sacks. The smell hit him, chemical, sharp, unmistakable. Cocaine. Real weight this time. Rafa loaded the bags into his trunk with hands that stayed steady, even as his heart pounded like a trapped animal. He knew microphones hidden under his shirt were capturing everything, the voices, the code phrases, the license plates. But microphones couldn't stop bullets. The drive back was a test by fire. Halfway to the drop point, headlights appeared behind him, close, aggressive. A car tailgating like it wanted to climb into his trunk. Rafa resisted the instinct to speed. Speed meant panic. Panic meant guilt. Instead, he kept steady, counted streetlights, watched mirrors. The car stayed with him, matching every lane change like a shadow. Then, at a red light, it pulled beside him. Two men stared through his window. No smile, no nod. Pure evaluation. Rafa didn't look away. He gave them the same bored, hardened stare any trafficker would give. The light turned green. The car accelerated ahead, then vanished into the night. He exhaled only when he reached the drop. That was how infiltration worked under Griselda's empire, not with invitations, but with traps, not with trust, but with fear. Every job was a blade at the throat. Every handshake carried the possibility of execution. The DEA knew it, Rafa knew it, and somewhere behind layers of middlemen, the Godmother was watching. Not his face, his nerve. The task force didn't call it a raid. Raids were loud and final. This was something else, an experiment with live ammunition. An ambush designed to pull one thread from Griselda's web and watch what moved. They chose a shipment night they believed was clean, a mid-level courier run, not too big, not too small, enough product to matter, enough men involved to reveal hierarchy. They set the trap with the precision of surgeons and the fear of gamblers. Rafa, wired and sweating under his shirt, played his part. The courier hub had instructed him to pick up a cash package and deliver it to a contact near the canals. He didn't know if the money was real or bait, but the DEA did. They had marked the bills, photographed serials, dusted edges, planted an invisible signature that could survive court. Surveillance units took positions, unmarked cars with engines off, agents on rooftops with long lenses, a tactical team parked 2 blocks away like a loaded gun waiting for permission. At 11:37 p.m., the contact arrived, young, nervous, wearing a baseball cap too low. He carried a duffel that looked heavy enough to break a shoulder. Rafa stepped forward, slow and calm, hands visible. The man's eyes darted to the shadows. His mouth moved as if praying. The transfer began. Then everything went wrong in half a second. A car rolled into the street without headlights, cutting the scene like a blade. Another followed behind it, sealing the block. The contact froze. Rafa felt the blood drain from his face. These weren't police. The way they moved was wrong. Too aggressive, too hungry. Doors opened. Men stepped out with pistols already raised. "Drop it!" one of them shouted, in Spanish, not English. The contact panicked and ran. A gunshot cracked the humid air. The duffel hit the pavement and burst slightly, cash flashing under streetlights like a spill of green paper. Rafa's training screamed at him to stay still, but survival screamed louder. He dove behind a parked car as bullets struck metal, sparks exploding like tiny fireworks. The DEA surveillance team heard the shots, and the radio erupted. "Gunfire! Gunfire! Move!" Tactical units surged forward. Tires screamed. Sirens stayed off. This wasn't about being loud. It was about catching bodies before they disappeared. The attackers weren't amateurs. They moved like men who had done this before. One rushed the duffel, grabbing cash with gloved hands. Another covered him, firing toward the shadows where he thought police might be. Rafa caught a glimpse of their faces, hard, young, ruthless, not rivals chasing money, enforcers following orders. A bullet shattered a window beside him, glass raining down. He crawled along the sidewalk, trying to keep the wire alive, trying to stay breathing. He could hear agents shouting from the far end of the block, boots pounding toward the scene. The attackers heard them too. They turned instantly, no hesitation, no confusion, then sprinted back toward their cars. The task force moved fast, but Miami nights belonged to criminals. As the first unmarked unit swung into the street, the attacker's lead car rammed the corner, nearly clipping the agent's bumper. A chase ignited. Engines roared. The street became a tunnel of speed and adrenaline. Rafa watched from the curb as taillights tore away into darkness like fleeing demons. One attacker jumped from the passenger seat mid-motion and disappeared into a narrow alley, vaulting fences like a ghost. Another fired backward from a window, forcing the pursuing car to swerve. For a moment, it was pure chaos. Radio static, screeching tires, muzzle flashes slicing the night. When it ended suddenly. The lead attacker's car slammed into a barrier near the canal, spun once, then stopped dead. The driver ran, vaulting over a railing toward the water. An agent tackled him inches before he jumped. They hit the concrete hard, both men sliding, fists swinging, the suspect fighting with animal desperation. The agent's hand gripped the gun first. Metal clattered, a knee pressed into ribs, cuffs snapped shut. On the pavement beside the wreck, the duffel lay torn open, cash scattered, evidence bleeding into the street. It wasn't the bust the DEA wanted, but it was the proof they needed. The empire was protecting itself. And someone, somewhere above these men, had decided that Knight's message was simple. Touch the money, and we shoot. He wasn't supposed to live long enough to become a problem. In Griselda's empire, hitmen were tools, used, paid, discarded. They weren't meant to collect secrets like trophies. But Mateo El Zurdo had survived too many jobs to remain stupid. He was the kind of man Miami didn't notice until it was too late. Quiet, lean, always in the background, hands steady as a surgeon's. He rode motorcycles without plates, carried pistols without fingerprints, and knew exactly how many seconds it took for a victim to realize death had arrived. For years, he did what he was paid to do: clean, fast, unquestioned. Traffic light executions, motel room silences, canal side disappearances. He was never the loud one, never the one who bragged. That's why he was trusted, because he acted like a shadow. But shadows see everything. Mateo knew which stash houses were real and which were decoys. He knew the names behind the nicknames. He knew who delivered money to whom, and which legitimate businesses were laundering cash through back doors. He knew the internal punishments: who got erased for skimming, who got buried for talking, who got spared because they were useful. Most importantly, he knew the one truth that could collapse the entire myth. Griselda didn't just order killings, she designed them. She didn't scream, she calculated. And recently, something had changed. After the ambush night, fear had shifted inside the organization like a new toxin. Middlemen began acting desperate. Couriers stopped sleeping at the same address twice. Meetings became shorter, colder. People whispered about wiretaps, about an undercover buyer who wasn't what he claimed, about the DEA inching closer, not by brute force, but by patience. Mateo felt it in the orders. The hits weren't just business anymore. They were cleanup, damage control, witnesses, loose ends. Men who had once been family suddenly became targets. That's when he understood a second truth. In this world, survival was temporary. The empire didn't protect its soldiers, it consumed them. So he did something hitmen weren't supposed to do. He began saving evidence. Not the kind that could be traced easily. No full ledgers, no obvious photos. Mateo wasn't suicidal. He collected fragments like insurance. A slip of paper with a warehouse code, a phone number connected to a courier coordinator, a stamped key tag from a safe deposit box, a name scribbled in a bar bathroom after a meeting. He hid these fragments across the city, inside the lining of an old leather belt, taped under a motel drawer, sealed in plastic, and buried near the roots of a palm tree like a secret coffin. He called it his life package. If he died, it would surface. At night, he replayed killings in his head not with guilt, but with cold evaluation. How many people had he erased for her? How many families shattered because a woman wanted control? He didn't feel shame. Hitmen didn't have time for shame. What he felt was something far more dangerous: clarity. And clarity leads to betrayal. Mateo started noticing new faces following him. Cars parked too long outside his building, a motorcycle he didn't recognize mirroring his turns. The organization didn't accuse you openly. It tested you, watched you, the same way they tested couriers, the same way they tested Rafa. One night, he returned home and found his door slightly open. Nothing stolen, no mess, just a cigarette left on the kitchen counter, still warm, still smoking. Mateo stared at it for a long time. In Miami, that wasn't a warning. That was a countdown. He finally understood. He didn't know too much by accident. He knew too much because he had been too useful for too long. And now, with the DEA tightening the noose, the empire would do what it always did when pressure rose. It would sacrifice its own blood to protect the throne. The tip came in broken Spanish over a burner phone at 2:19 a.m. A whisper barely louder than breath. A cash run, big, moving across the causeway before sunrise. Not cocaine this time. Money. The lifeblood. The kind of transport that meant someone in Griselda's system was nervous enough to relocate the vault. The task force didn't hesitate. Cash was easier to trace than powder, and a cash run forced mistakes. People got greedy, got clumsy, got fast. Unmarked units rolled out like predators, headlights off. Radio chatter kept low. The plan was simple: tail the vehicle, wait for probable cause, take it clean. No heroics. But in Miami, nothing stayed clean. At 3:07 a.m., a black sedan pulled from a waterfront condo parking garage and merged onto the MacArthur Causeway like it owned the road. The car moved too smoothly. No hesitation, no unnecessary lane changes. Professional. 2 men inside, one driving, one scanning mirrors. DEA teams fell in behind at distance, rotating positions so the sedan wouldn't spot a single tail too long. A helicopter wasn't an option at this hour. Too loud, too obvious. This had to be street work. The sedan hit the long stretch of bridge and suddenly accelerated. Not casual speeding. A hard push. Engine snarling. Tires biting asphalt. The driver wasn't running from traffic. He was running from suspicion he couldn't name. The task force leader made the call. "We're compromised. Stay with him." The sedan swerved into the left lane, cutting through empty road like a blade. An unmarked Crown Vic matched speed. Another unit slid behind, boxing him without getting too close. The causeway became a narrow tunnel of ocean wind and streetlights flashing like gun muzzle bursts. At 90 miles per hour, Miami turned into a blur. Then the driver did something that confirmed everything. He killed his taillights. For a half second, the sedan became a shadow in the dark. The pursuing agents cursed. No lights meant collision could happen at any moment. The sedan darted between lanes, trying to force a mistake, trying to make a cop crash without ever touching him. It was warfare without gunfire. The lead agent hit the siren switch, one sharp burst, then off. Just enough to spook him. It worked. The sedan fishtailed, corrected, and shot toward an exit ramp. Units tightened. The driver clipped the guard rail. Sparks erupted. then kept going. The passenger twisted in his seat, and suddenly a window dropped. A hand appeared holding a pistol. The first shot cracked the night. The bullet tore through the air and struck metal, ringing like a bell. The agents flinched but stayed locked in. Another shot, then another. The chase wasn't just a chase now. It was a rolling gunfight over black water. A pursuing unit tried to pit the sedan, tap the rear quarter panel, spin him out. The sedan jerked away at the last moment, sliding dangerously close to the edge. Ocean wind screamed through open windows. The driver didn't care if he died. He cared if the money lived. The passenger grabbed a duffel bag and, in pure desperation, flung it out of the window. The bag hit the road like a corpse and burst open. Bundles of cash exploding into the air, bills spinning like green confetti under streetlights. The wind ripped them across lanes, across the bridge, across the dark water. It was the most Miami thing imaginable, an empire bleeding money into the ocean to stay alive. Units swerved to avoid the bag and loose bundles. For one instant, the sedan gained distance. Then the helicopter, previously held back, finally appeared over the bridge, rotors thundering, spotlights slicing through darkness and pinning the fleeing car like a spear. The sedan had nowhere to hide now. It slammed into the exit curve too fast. Tires screamed. The rear end snapped out. The car spun once, twice, then crashed nose first into the barrier with a violent crunch that shook the bridge. Airbags exploded like white clouds. The passenger crawled out, blood on his forehead, trying to run. He made it 3 steps before an agent tackled him hard onto the concrete. The pistol skidded away. The driver tried to flee the other side, limping toward the railing, but 2 agents boxed him in and drove him down with knees and cuffs. When the dust settled, the causeway was littered with drifting money. Bills stuck to asphalt, floating in puddles, trapped in guardrail seams like evidence refusing to disappear. And for the first time in months, the task force held something real in their hands. Not rumors, not whispers, not fear. Cash that could talk. The sedan crash gave the task force what wiretaps never could. Physical proof with fingerprints, roots, and panic stains. The seized cash was only the surface. The real treasure was inside the car. A torn notebook wedged beneath the passenger seat, pages damp with sweat and ocean mist. It looked harmless at first. Random numbers, short names, arrows. But the lead analyst's eyes narrowed the moment he saw the repeating codes. Those weren't phone numbers. They were coordinates. Back at headquarters, the evidence room transformed into a war room. Agents photographed every page, enlarged the scribbles, pinned them to cork boards. A mapping specialist began plotting the coordinates onto Miami's grid. 1 dot near Little Havana, another near Hialeah, 2 clustered close to the port, a line of points that followed the city like a spine. The detective in charge didn't celebrate. He leaned closer to the map, jaw tight, because he knew what this meant. The cash car wasn't improvising. It was traveling between nodes, and nodes meant safe houses, stash locations, cash vaults, weapon rooms, meeting sites. A hidden infrastructure keeping the empire alive. For the first time, the task force could see the body of the beast. They cross-referenced the dots with existing surveillance logs, license plates spotted outside suspected houses, faces seen entering laundromats, vans that made midnight runs and returned empty, patterns snapped into place like magnets. The same silver Toyota had appeared near 2 points on different weeks. The same female courier had been seen entering one location and calling a payphone 2 blocks away. The wiretap analysts replayed recordings and noticed the same coded phrase repeated before movement. "The shirts are being folded." Every time that phrase appeared, one of the dots lit up with activity. The Empire had been talking in riddles. Now the riddle had a key. But the task force still needed a bridge from houses to Griselda. A safe house alone didn't convict a ghost. So they turned to the man they'd grabbed alive from the causeway, the passenger, whose silence was already cracking under the weight of what he'd almost died protecting. In interrogation, he didn't scream. He didn't plead. He simply stared at the table like he was watching his own funeral. The detective slid the enlarged map in front of him. One dot circled in red, then another, then 5 more. "You know these places," the detective said quietly. The man swallowed. His hands trembled once, just once, then clenched into fists as if trying to crush fear with muscle. "If I talk," he whispered, voice raw, "I'm dead. My mother's dead. My kids—" The detective leaned in. "You're already dead," he said. "You just don't know the date yet." That line broke something. The man's eyes filled with the kind of terror money could never cure. He didn't give full names. He gave functions. Cash house, powder house, guns, meeting, and then, almost involuntarily, he said the word every informant eventually said like a curse. "Madrina." The room went cold. Task force leaders knew this was the moment they'd been waiting for. A map of safe houses meant they could finally hit the network like a surgeon cutting arteries. But it also meant escalation. If they struck too soon, Griselda would vanish again, burn the system, rebuild elsewhere. If they waited too long, the network would sense danger and relocate everything. So they planned the strike like a military operation. Synchronized warrants, simultaneous entry teams, surveillance drones, highway intercept units, undercover signals, a multi-point takedown designed to collapse the machine in one night. As dawn approached, the board glowed with red circles and connecting lines. Miami turned into a chessboard, and the pieces were finally in position. The detective stared at Griselda's photo pinned above the map and spoke the truth no one wanted to admit. "We're not arresting a woman. We're bringing down a kingdom." The raid wasn't planned like a police operation. It was planned like a war. For weeks, the task force lived inside maps. Miami was no longer a city. It was a grid of targets, safe houses marked in red, suspected drop points in blue, routes traced with arrows like blood vessels. Every decision was measured against the same nightmare. If Griselda sensed pressure, she would evaporate, burn the network, kill the weak links, disappear back into Colombia like smoke. So the plan had one rule: no warning, no gaps, no mercy. One night, one synchronized strike. Cut the arteries before the heart could run. At headquarters, the briefing room filled with bodies in plain clothes and tactical gear. DEA supervisors stood beside homicide detectives and federal prosecutors who cared more about courtroom survival than street glory. A large board displayed the operation name in black marker. Under it were the warrants, stacked like weapons, signed, sealed, legally sharp. Every warrant was a promise. If the teams hit clean, the evidence would hold. If they didn't, years of work would collapse under a defense attorney's smile. A lieutenant from the tactical unit tapped the map with a gloved finger. 4 entry teams, he said. 2 perimeter units, 1 rapid response in reserve. We hit target A and B at OFR 10, C and D at OFR 12. No delays. If one door takes longer, we move anyway. His voice was calm, but his eyes were hard. He knew what waited inside those houses, armed men with nothing to lose. The wiretap team gave the final confirmation. Calls intercepted the night before suggested movement. Cash shifting. Couriers nervous. A coded phrase repeating like a heartbeat. The party is early. The analysts believed it meant Griselda was relocating product. That made the raid urgent. You don't let a kingdom move its treasure. Outside in the parking lot, agents loaded equipment into unmarked vans. Breaching tools, flashbangs, battering rams, evidence kits, gloves, cameras. Dogs barked from kennels, their excitement too sharp to ignore. One agent checked his weapon 3 times, then stood still and stared at his hands like they belonged to someone else. Another quietly wrote a phone number on the inside of his wrist with a pen, his wife's, like a superstition. A prosecutor pulled the lead detective aside. "Remember," she warned, "we need ledgers, we need kilos, we need bank keys, we need anything that ties her directly to distribution. No loose handling, no missing chain of custody." The detective nodded, but his mind wasn't in court. His mind was on the street, where evidence didn't matter if agents died before sunrise. In the corner of the room, Rafa sat with his head lowered, wired unit removed, identity burned. He wasn't going in tonight. Undercover assets never went into final raids. Too many eyes, too many guns, too many chances for recognition. Still, he looked up once and said quietly, "She'll have exits." The room didn't answer because everyone already knew. They had studied her habits. She used layers. She trusted few. She kept vehicles ready. She slept light. Her people moved with military paranoia. Guns under couches, cameras on porches, coded knocks at doors. Griselda wasn't just a criminal, she was a strategist, and strategists never wait to be captured. That's why the task force scheduled the raid before dawn, between 4 and 5 a.m., when arrogance sleeps and guards blink too long, when the city is quiet enough for a battering ram to sound like thunder. At 03:52, radios clicked on. The convoy rolled out, unmarked and silent, cutting through Miami streets like a shadow army. No sirens, no flashing lights, only engines humming low and the weight of inevitability. By the time they reached their positions, the ocean air was cold and the sky just starting to pale. And every man in that operation understood one brutal truth. Tonight wasn't about arresting a legend. It was about proving she could bleed like everyone else. At 04:10 a.m., Miami was still asleep, but the task force was already moving like a single organism. Vans rolled to the curb without headlights, doors slid open, boots hit pavement, radios whispered, a K9 unit tensed at the leash, muscles vibrating with violence held back by discipline. 1 block away, a second team stacked at the rear entrance of a modest residence that looked too ordinary to contain an empire. The lead agent raised a hand. The city held its breath. Then the battering ram struck. The door didn't open, it collapsed. Wood splintered inward, locks snapping like bones. Flash bang, white light, thunder in a hallway. Federal agents, down! Shadows moved with rifles, slicing corners, clearing rooms with practiced speed. The house smelled of perfume and stale air conditioning, a strange softness masking something lethal beneath. Upstairs, a bedroom light flicked on. A figure stood in the doorway, small, unarmed, hair pulled back. Griselda Blanco didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't even look confused. Her eyes were already open, already awake, as if she'd been sleeping with one ear pressed to the future. Two agents rushed her, pinned her arms, snapped cuffs around her wrists. The steel clicked. That sound, small, final, felt louder than gunfire. The Godmother stared at the men holding her like she was studying their faces for future use. "Griselda Blanco," the agent said, voice tight. "You're under arrest." For 1 second, the room froze in the strange intimacy of capture. Then her mouth moved, almost a smile. "Finally," she murmured in Spanish, soft enough to be mistaken for a sigh. Downstairs, the house began to bleed evidence. A false panel behind a closet slid loose. Bundles wrapped in plastic emerged like hidden organs. Bricks of cocaine stacked clean and uniform. Cash sealed in vacuum bags, layered in suitcases, stuffed inside walls. The evidence team moved in fast, photographing, tagging, weighing. Numbers climbed in the air like a curse. Ledgers surfaced, coded columns, initials, dates, city names, keys to safe deposit boxes, multiple passports, a small notebook with phone numbers written like prayers. One agent held up a set of keys and whispered, "This is it." But Griselda didn't look at the cocaine. She didn't look at the money. She looked at the agents' faces, measuring them, marking them, as if even this moment was just another business meeting. When the lead agent read the charges, conspiracy to import, manufacture, distribute, she listened like a woman hearing the weather forecast. The prosecutor's words were cold, rehearsed, lethal, federal time, years, a life carved into numbers. And still, Griselda didn't flinch. Outside, neighbors peeked through curtains. They saw only flashing lights now, police tape, silhouettes. They didn't see the inside, the calm of a woman surrounded by guns, the stillness of a predator caught in a trap she'd once believed was too slow to close. On the front lawn, as she was guided toward the vehicle, she turned her head slightly and looked back at the house, not with regret, not with panic, but with calculation, like she was already rebuilding in her mind. The lead agent watched her and felt something chilling. This arrest was historic, yes. Feb 17, 1985, the moment the DEA finally put hands on the Godmother, but it wasn't victory yet. It was only containment. Because Griselda Blanco didn't rule with her body. She ruled with fear. And fear doesn't die just because the queen is in handcuffs. The courtroom didn't feel like justice. It felt like a cage built out of paperwork and fear. By the time Griselda Blanco was brought in, federal agents had already transformed her myth into binders. Hundreds of pages stamped, numbered, sealed, surveillance photos, wiretap transcripts, evidence logs with weights and serial numbers. Each document was a brick meant to bury her alive under legality. But myths don't die easily. Miami had been living under her shadow for too long. Even the courthouse air seemed tense, as if the building itself understood who was walking through its doors. She entered in a plain suit, hair pulled back, makeup controlled. No diamonds, no gold, no queen's crown, only fabric and a calm face. The Godmother didn't need luxury to project power. She sat at the defense table like she owned it, hands folded, eyes scanning the room with the cold focus of a strategist studying an enemy formation. The jury avoided her gaze. Most people did. The prosecutor's opening statement was sharp, almost surgical. He didn't speak in stories. He spoke in facts. Conspiracy to import cocaine, to distribute, to build a criminal enterprise that fed Miami's blood economy. He pointed at the evidence table like a man pointing at a corpse. "This is what she brought into the United States," he said, voice steady. "Not only drugs, violence." Then the parade began. Agents testified about surveillance nights, cars tailing safe houses, coded calls replayed until patterns emerged. Analysts explained the language of crime, how shirts meant kilos, how party meant shipment, how a simple phrase could hide $100,000. Evidence technicians described the seizures. Bricks of cocaine sealed like industrial product, cash bundles stacked like construction materials. Every witness added a layer. Every layer tightened the noose. But the defense was prepared. That was the second war. Courtroom war. Her attorney didn't deny cocaine existed. He attacked connection. "Where is her fingerprint on the product?" he asked. "Where is her voice on a wiretap ordering a shipment? Where is the direct transaction?" He spoke like a man trying to cut red strings off a board one by one. Griselda watched him without emotion, as if she was watching a tool perform its function. The task force knew this moment was fragile. Empires didn't survive raids. They survived lawyers. All it took was one broken chain of custody, one witness with a dirty history, one juror whose fear outweighed logic. Prosecutors walked like men on ice. They knew her reputation could bend people before evidence ever reached their brains. Then came the witnesses nobody trusted, but everyone needed. Cooperators. Men who had once moved kilos for her sat in the witness chair with sweat on their upper lips, eyes flicking toward the gallery like they expected bullets to arrive through the walls. They spoke carefully, naming roles, describing routes, explaining how orders traveled downward without leaving traces upward. Each testimony felt like a confession written in fear. One witness paused mid-sentence, swallowed hard, and whispered, "She didn't have to say it twice." The courtroom went still. Griselda's lips curved slightly, not into a smile, into something colder, a reminder, a warning without words. In the end, the verdict didn't come like thunder. It came like a door closing. Guilty. The sentence dropped heavy. Federal prison, 15 years. A number spoken aloud that sounded like an era, not a punishment. Cameras flashed, pens scribbled, headlines formed. Miami exhaled as if it had finally woken from a nightmare. But the lead detective didn't celebrate, because as Griselda stood to leave, she turned her head and looked back once, toward the prosecution table, toward the agents who had chased her for years. Her expression was calm, almost polite. And in that calm was the message that haunted the task force long after the courtroom emptied. This was not the end. This was only the first conviction. Florida still had bodies. Federal prison didn't end Griselda Blanco's war. It only moved it behind concrete. In Miami, cocaine cases could be measured in kilos. Homicides were measured in silence. And Florida had been collecting silence for years. 3 bodies, 3 scenes, 3 files that had never closed. The murders didn't look like street chaos. They looked like decisions. Clean, targeted, executed with the kind of control detectives only saw in organized power. The first homicide file came from a parking lot near a strip mall. A man found slumped in the driver's seat, engine still running, radio still playing like the city didn't care. 2 shots through the window, no robbery, no struggle. Just execution and disappearance. Witnesses said they saw a motorcycle, 2 riders, helmets, and then nothing. Miami's signature. By the time patrol arrived, the killers were already ghosts. The second case was worse because it felt personal. A woman in her early 30s found in a small apartment, furniture untouched, hair still neat. Only the blood told the truth. The door hadn't been forced. Whoever entered had been expected. A neighbor reported hearing quiet voices, then one sharp crack, then silence. No screaming, no panic. The kind of murder that suggests the victim understood exactly why it was happening. The third file lived in the canals, Florida's black water, where evidence went to die. A man found face down near a concrete edge, pockets full, watch still on his wrist. The medical examiner noted blunt trauma and signs of restraint. The kind of death that doesn't happen by accident, no matter how drunk someone gets. For years, detectives had suspected the same thing but couldn't prove it. These weren't isolated killings. They were pieces of a larger architecture of fear. Men who had stepped out of line, people who had talked, rivals who had tested a border. In Miami's cocaine war, punishment wasn't emotional. It was strategic. Now, with Griselda in federal custody, Florida investigators believed they had the one chance they'd been waiting for. Her cocaine conviction had cracked the myth. Witnesses were rattled. Middlemen were scared. The empire was weakened. If they were going to attach bodies to the Godmother, it had to happen now, before fear rebuilt itself around her name. A homicide detective from Dade County sat with the DEA lead and laid the 3 files on the table like offerings. Photos, autopsy summaries, ballistics, witness statements full of "I don't know" and "I didn't see." He pointed at the patterns. Same caliber, same execution style, same timing. Murders aligned with shipment disputes and internal betrayals flagged by wiretaps. "We've always known," he said quietly, "but knowing isn't enough." The task force began stitching the cases together with forensic thread, ballistics comparisons, cell tower data where available, old informant notes resurrected from drawers. A witness from the strip mall who had gone silent suddenly agreed to talk, only because Griselda was behind bars, and he believed distance was safety. He described a man he recognized, an enforcer connected to her circle. Another witness from the apartment case admitted the victim had been involved with a courier crew. She'd tried to leave, tried to run. The canal victim, detectives learned, had once handled cash drops. He'd threatened to disappear with money. He never made it. Slowly, the homicide cases stopped being cold. They became warm with implication. But homicide prosecution required a different kind of proof than cocaine trafficking. Cocaine left weight and fingerprints and money trails. Murder required something more fragile, credibility. Witnesses who would survive cross-examination. Witnesses willing to risk the last thing Miami always demanded, your life. As the investigators built the case, they understood they weren't just fighting for convictions. They were fighting against a legend, against a reputation that could reach into courtrooms through fear alone. And every time a witness hesitated, every time someone suddenly forgot details, the detective could feel her presence, like a hand still controlling the city from behind prison walls. Florida didn't just want to prove she sold cocaine. Florida wanted to prove she ordered blood. The murder case should have been the clean finish. The federal conviction had already bruised her empire. Florida homicide could have buried it for good. The detectives believed they finally had momentum. Witnesses cracking, patterns aligning, old files breathing again. But murder trials don't collapse because the truth is weak. They collapse because the system is fragile and fear is patient. It started with whispers inside the courthouse. A clerk mentioned an unknown man asking about schedules. A witness reported being followed in traffic. Same sedan, same distance, never too close. One cooperating informant backed out overnight, leaving a note that said only, "I have children." Another arrived to a meeting with shaking hands and refused to get out of the car. "You can't protect me," he said, eyes wild. "Nobody can." Then came the poison that prosecutors hate most: compromised credibility. Defense attorneys began cutting into the case like sharks smelling blood. They didn't attack the bodies. They attacked the people telling the story. They dragged witnesses through their pasts: drug use, theft charges, immigration issues, lies told to police years ago. In open court, under bright lights, every cooperator looked like a criminal bargaining for survival, because that's exactly what they were. And juries don't like dirty witnesses, even when dirty witnesses are the only ones who can speak. But the real damage came from inside the prosecution itself. A key issue surfaced: contaminated proceedings, allegations that exposed the case to legal collapse. There were claims of improper handling around witness arrangements and evidentiary conduct that gave the defense a weapon sharper than any pistol: procedural violation. In murder court, procedure is sacred. If you poison the process, you poison the verdict. The judge's patience thinned, motions stacked up. Evidence that detectives had treated as solid suddenly became questionable. How it was collected, how it was documented, who had access, what promises were made. Every technical flaw became a crack. Every crack became a possible acquittal. Prosecutors tried to stabilize the floor beneath them. They refiled motions. They narrowed charges. They debated pushing forward versus cutting losses. But the defense had one advantage Florida could never fully defeat: Griselda's legend. Even behind bars, her name bent people. Witnesses entered court like soldiers walking into an ambush. Some contradicted themselves. Some forgot dates. Some suddenly couldn't recognize faces they'd once described with certainty. One witness stared at Griselda across the courtroom and went silent for 7 full seconds. 7 seconds that felt like an eternity, before answering a basic question. The jury noticed. The jury always notices fear. And when fear enters court, truth becomes negotiable. The homicide detective, who had carried these 3 cases like scars, sat in the back row watching it unravel. He had seen bodies. He had seen mothers collapse at crime scenes. He had spent nights hunting patterns in a city addicted to violence. And now, under legal fluorescent lights, he watched something worse than murder. Justice slipping away through paperwork. In the hallway outside court, he muttered to the DEA lead, "She didn't have to win. She just had to survive." That was the poison. The murders weren't being disproven. They were being drowned in procedure, in credibility attacks, in fear disguised as reasonable doubt. And in that suffocating courtroom air, everyone understood the terrifying reality. Sometimes the most powerful weapon in crime isn't a gun. It's the ability to rot a case from the inside. By 1998, the homicide war had changed shape. It was no longer a clean battle between evidence and denial. It was a grinding contest of endurance. Florida prosecutors trying to keep a fragile case alive, defense attorneys attacking every crack like it was a doorway, witnesses aging, disappearing, losing courage. Time was doing what bullets couldn't, eroding certainty. And Griselda understood time better than anyone. From prison, she watched the system the way predators watch weather. She didn't need to run anymore. She didn't need motorcycles at traffic lights. All she needed was to survive court without giving the state a clean victory. Her lawyers understood it too. They didn't promise innocence. They promised collapse. They poisoned jury trust, questioned procedure, shredded witnesses until everyone in the room felt dirty. Florida's prosecutors faced an ugly truth. If they pushed to trial, they risked losing everything. A single acquittal on murder charges would give Griselda back her legend. It would tell the streets she was untouchable even in court. Worse, it could make witnesses die for nothing. So the conversation shifted to the only language the justice system uses when it's exhausted: negotiation. The plea deal began quietly, behind closed doors, away from cameras. Long meetings, cold legal math, defense demands, prosecutors weighing risk like generals counting casualties. They needed a conviction that would stick, something that couldn't be undone by technical flaws, something that would attach blood to her name in official ink. Griselda listened to the terms without emotion. She had heard worse numbers before: 15 years, federal time, years measured in concrete. Florida's offer wasn't about mercy. It was about certainty. Plead guilty to 3 second-degree murders and receive a 20-year sentence running concurrently with what she was already serving. It wasn't freedom, but it wasn't the death blow either. That was the genius of it. She wasn't winning. She was managing loss. In the courtroom, the plea hearing felt like a funeral without tears. No dramatic confession, no breakdown, no apology. Just a woman in prison clothes standing straight, hands calm, face blank. The judge asked if she understood the rights she was giving up. She answered yes. The judge asked if she understood the sentence. Yes, the judge asked if she was pleading voluntarily. Yes. Her voice was steady, almost bored, like she was signing paperwork to buy a house. The prosecutor read the murders into the record, names, dates, locations. Each detail hit the room like a hammer. Family members of victims sat rigid, faces carved from grief. They had waited years for this moment, for the truth to be spoken in public. But the truth arrived thin, without emotion, without justice's satisfying drama. It arrived as a bargain. When the judge finally accepted the plea, the courtroom exhaled, relief mixed with bitterness. Florida had won a conviction, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like closing a door that should have been slammed. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked the detective if this meant the Godmother was finally finished. He didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He looked at the cameras like a man who had stared too long into crime and learned what it really was. She didn't confess, he said quietly. She calculated. Inside, Griselda was led away, and for the first time, the state had something permanent, not rumors, not nicknames, not street legend, a legal record that tied her to blood. But as the cuffs clicked and the guard guided her through the doorway, she turned her head slightly and met no one's eyes. She didn't need to, because even in defeat, she had achieved her real goal. She had traded uncertainty for survival. In the cocaine war, survival was always the only currency that mattered. In 2004, the gates finally opened, not with celebration, but with paperwork. Griselda Blanco walked out older, heavier, her legend intact like a scar that never faded. Cameras waited, but she offered them nothing. No speech, no tears, no regret. Just the same cold stillness that had survived raids, trials, and years of concrete. U.S. authorities didn't free her into Miami's streets. They handed her to immigration, because some monsters aren't released. They are removed. The deportation order was the final stamp. She was no longer a federal problem, only a ghost to be shipped away. On the plane, she stared through the window at the shrinking lights of America. Expression unreadable. The empire was gone. The fear was not. And Colombia was waiting, quietly, like a past that never forgets. In September 2012, Medellin felt too calm, like the city was holding its breath. Griselda Blanco had lived quietly since deportation, but quiet was never the same as safe. Legends don't retire. They just become targets with older bones. That afternoon, she stepped out of a small butcher shop, a plastic bag in hand, moving like an ordinary aging woman in a neighborhood that pretended not to remember her name. Then the past arrived on two wheels. A motorcycle slid close, smooth, familiar, almost ceremonial. The passenger lifted a pistol and fired at point-blank range. 2 shots. Clean, efficient. The same signature Miami had feared decades earlier, now returning like karma with perfect symmetry. She collapsed onto the pavement, blood pooling fast, the bag tearing open beside her. No warning, no speech, no final redemption. Medellin watched in silence as the cocaine godmother died the way she had ruled, suddenly, brutally, and without mercy. Her story ends where every criminal empire ends, not in glory, but in emptiness. Cocaine made Griselda Blanco powerful, yet it also turned her life into a permanent prison, built from paranoia, betrayal, and blood. The money she moved couldn't buy peace, couldn't buy trust, couldn't buy sleep. Every victory demanded another body, another lie, another scar carried by families who never chose this war. Law enforcement spent years chasing a shadow, but the real tragedy was larger than one woman. Drugs turned cities into graveyards and turned children into orphans long before bullets arrive. If there is one lesson worth keeping, it is this: crime doesn't create freedom. It only sells the illusion of it. And in the end, the price is always paid by someone somewhere in tears.